Moving on to chapter 3, now lesson 8. Piggybacking on the idea of coordinate grids. Now, coordinate grids or coordinate graphs is what we did in lesson 3.7. Things, once again, that we didn't know we learned across the hallway. Some of you came over here in 6th grade like, yep, I remember this. Some of you, I didn't get it so much. So we went over it in lesson 3.7. I introduced you in the vocabulary some terminology that I use to help you remember how to plot things on the coordinate grid. The idea of the X and the Y, if we don't remember which one comes first, then it was the idea that I have to run if I really want to jump and jump well. I have to get a running start. Now, I could be running forward, I could be running backwards, depending on where I am. But I always start at that point of origin. If it's a positive, therefore on my X-axis, my first one, I'm going to run forward. If it's a negative on my X-axis, my first number, then I'm going to run backwards. My second point is always my Y. Once I run, then I figure out if I'm going to jump up or I'm going to jump down. So on my Y-axis, which is my vertical line, then if it's positive, I can jump up. If it's negative, I can jump down. So let's say I have a negative, negative. That tells me on my first one, I'm going to run backwards. And on my second one, I'm going to jump down. That's going to take me where this Roman numeral 3 is. Now, when we did the definitions, I introduced you to the extra one, which wasn't necessarily in chapter 3.7. And that is the idea of the quadrants. Our book shows you Roman numerals in this way, where they're just the lines without anything on top. Nothing wrong with that, but there are times, maybe on the I Learn, I'm not sure how they're going to show you it set up, so I just added the lines on top. What those lines are is just indicating that it's actually a capital I. It depends on how your computer enters it in or what type of font you're using. The lines on top say the exact same thing as the previous slide, which I'll go back to in just a second. It's just showing you that these are actually capital I. So an I just represents 1 in the Roman numeral language. So if I put 2 of them together, then it's the number 2. 3 together makes 3. V is a 5. So in Roman numerals, if there's a 1 in front of a 5, it's actually showing you have to subtract, and that's a number 4, because a V by itself would be a 5. These are the exact same thing in our book. They're just showing you that they don't have the lines on top. So it doesn't matter if there's lines on top for I's or if they're using just the straight lines for capital I's. It just still means the same thing. That's a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4. Like we talked about in the last video, we go ironically, counterclockwise, when most things are clockwise. But if I remember that a positive forward number and a positive upward number is a quadrant 1, positive makes a 1. If I go back negative and then up, so my X is positive, but my Y, or excuse me, my X is negative, but my Y is positive, then that's a quadrant 2. Both negatives mean that I'm going to go backwards and then down for quadrant 3. And then I finish with quadrant 4, going forward again, but this time down for positive negative. All of those relationships are always going to take me into those specific quadrants. When I look at what I'm being asked to do, I'm going to be asked to do some reflections or some translations or maybe some identification of what quadrant we're in. So it's not a difficult lesson, it's just some terminology that we haven't used before, but once we get into it and practice it, I'm sure that every one of you will find it rather easy to do. When I start looking at it then, its introduction says the point -3, 4, so the ordered pair of -3 for my X, +4 for my Y, represents the location of a bookstore on a map of a shopping mall. Identify the quadrant where the point is located. So my final answer is going to be a Roman numeral 1, a Roman numeral 2, 3, or a 4, depending on where it is. It says, think what the x-coordinate is. Well, my x-coordinate is what? It's a negative, right? So my first number is a -3. I know I'm going backwards. So the point is 3 units, because it's a -3, to the left. So anytime I'm plotting, then I'm going to have my point of origin, and then once again I'm going to move in the direction it tells me to. It's -3, so I'm going to go back 3, and then I pause. And then it says, since the point is to the left of the origin, it it must be located in either quadrant. So what two quadrants are to the left of the point of origin? Well, I point quadrants 2 and quadrants 3. So it has to be one of those. Now, if you are more comfortable putting your lines on top of your capital I's, feel free to do so. I didn't, simply because they're not here on those. Step 2 then says, now I got to figure out where my y is taking me to figure out what quadrant I'm in. Think, well, the y coordinate is positive, right? My second number, so I went -3 now, I'm looking at the positive 4. So the point is 4 units up, straight up, from the origin. Since the point is above the origin, it must be located in quadrant 2, right? Because I went backwards and therefore I had to go up, has to be quadrant 2. When I move left and move right, everything that I plot in this area is going to be a quadrant 2, and I know that. So I added this to this chart. You are more than welcome to copy this down in your book if it helps you to remember them. Anything in quadrant 2 is going to be a negative, then a positive, always. Everything is plotted in this area. If I'm looking at quadrant 1, they're always going to be positive, positives. So it shows positive, positive. Anything in quadrant 3 will have ordered pairs that where the x is a negative and the y is a negative, because I'm always going to go backwards and down. And therefore, if it's in quadrant 4, all of the points that I can plot here are always going to be positive, followed by a negative in the y-axis. Ah, there we go. Oh, I forgot. One of the steps is to graph that. That's why that's there. So I have to go make sure that I go over to the left 3 and go up 4 and put my point. Now I can move on. All right, so some math terms that we haven't used yet is the idea of line of symmetry, which you're introduced at a very young age to. It just means that I have a line, and if I fold the object in half, it's going to be identical on both pieces. So such as this triangle here, I have a line of symmetry. If I fold it, then the two halves are going to look identical from the center. I have all sorts of different shapes that I can have, and these are not the only ones by any means. But any shape, I can check to see if it has a line of symmetry. Some shapes will actually have multiple lines of symmetry. If I took a rectangle and I cut it across horizontally, it would also have a second line of symmetry. Things in nature often have lines of symmetry. If I took a butterfly and it goes straight down the middle, there's a line of symmetry. When some artists work, they make sure that their opposite sides have lines of symmetry, such as the Batman symbol. If I fold it in half, it is identical on both sides, so it has a vertical line of symmetry. Some of our letters will have lines of symmetry. Some of our letters have multiple lines of symmetry. This not only has a vertical line of symmetry, but the H also has a horizontal line of symmetry. X's have vertical and horizontal lines of symmetry. A square, all 4 sides are even, 4 corners are 90-degree angles, has multiple lines of symmetry. So does this star, so does this cross. So just knowing that what a symmetry is saying, it just means that if I fold it in half, then each side is going to look the same. I can also use the terminology of reflection. And that is a word that we often use, hopefully. We've talked about reflections, because anytime you've seen your face, it's always been a reflection. Do you realize that the human eye is the only thing it's never seen is its own face? Think about that for a moment. Reflections mean that there's a line and that I'm having a reflected side. So I know that I have a scar on my cheek. When I look at it in the mirror, it looks like it would actually be my right cheek, but it's on my left. On the symmetry, if there was an apple, when I'm looking at the actual tree, it would look like it's on the left side of the tree, but if I would look at it on this side, on its reflection, it would be on the right side. So reflections are just going to be an identical image straight across. Same with the cat. If it had a different marking here, then it would appear to be on the opposite side of the face. When I talk about shapes then, The reason I point that out is because the corner here, when I'm looking at it, is it's in the top left-hand corner, but on B, since it's a reflection, a mirrored image, if I folded it up, the corner is on the right-hand side. So when we look at reflections, I know that I'm just going to fold it up, and it's going to look like mirrored images. That's what a reflection actually means. If I took these triangles, notice that one's pointing to the left while the other one is pointing to the right. So they are a mirrored image of one another. Therefore, we know that it is a reflection. When I get into the next half of our lessons, then it says to identify the lines of symmetry in the rectangle. So here's the rectangle here in red, and I have to figure out what my lines of symmetry are. It says the blank axis is a horizontal line of symmetry. So which axis is horizontal going straight across? That is my x-axis, right? And then therefore it also has a vertical, which one goes straight up and down. The V or the Y, right, makes the lines going straight up and down. That's my vertical line of symmetry. With that information then, I can answer some basic questions about this rectangle. Look at points A and B. So A and B are these right-hand side coordinates. What do you notice about the x coordinates on A and B? So when you look in your book, hopefully you'll see that this is a +5 followed by a +4. And on B, it's a +5 followed by a -4. What they're wanting you to notice is that the 5s are identical numbers, right? The x-axis for both points is the same. They're both +5. But what you notice about the y-axis is, well, the axes, plural for axis, have opposite numbers. I have a +4, I have a -4. If I have a line of symmetry, then one of them is going to be the same, and then the second one is always going to be opposites one to another. Point B is a reflection of point A across which axis then? And how do you know? The one that stays the same is the axis that it uses for its reflection. So the x-axis is the answer because, how do I know? Second point, if this was a homework assignment, because the x-coordinates are the same. So if I'm talking about reflections, the one that stays the same is the axis that it reflects upon. Oh, and then I just put down there, same thing we said before with the pictures. If I would then fold this in half, these would be in identical spots one to another. So I know it is indeed a reflection. Looking at points A and D then, now this just drops down. It's the same ones right underneath the ones we just did in your book. If we have A and D, we're talking about these top 2 points. Look at those, and what do you notice about the x coordinates on those? We'll have a -5 and a +5. Well, I notice that the x-axes, once again, plural for 2 of them, are opposites one another, but the y, in this case, are the same, both +4s. So I know that the line of reflection on that one is the one that stays the same. It has to be the y-axis, because the y's stay the same, both +4s. Which point is a reflection of point B across the x-axis and then the y-axis? So I have 2 steps of reflection. Okay, so let's see. First it says that I have to use point B, which I circled, and it has to go across the x-axis. It's my horizontal line. So x-axis, that takes me back to A, right? So if it takes me back to A, but then it says also across the y-axis, so now I have to go from here and I have to fold it in half over to here. So I'm going over to my D. So it's what is called a double reflection. I'm going across the x, then I'm going across the y. Therefore I know it has to be point D. Compare the coordinates of point B with the coordinates of point D then. So what do those coordinates look like if it's a double reflection? Well, I have a +5 and a -5, and then I have a -4 and a +4. So if it's a double reflection, therefore it reflects across both of the different axes, then it's always going to have opposites for both coordinates. So double reflection, both of the coordinates are always going to be a positive, negative, negative, positive, whatever the original setup is for the original point. All right, so here's where we have to focus in on exactly what I'm asking for on my homework assignments, and I'm always going to work through examples for you, so paying attention is key to this, and this will go rather quickly because these should be pretty basic. The thing about these is they're only worth 1 point. You can't really show work on these different questions. So if I understand what's going on and I'm following along like I'm supposed to and I fill out my book, then I should be able to do very well on my homework assignment. Here we go. Once again, focusing. Now, if you copied down like I had suggested before, that the first quadrant is a positive positive, the second quadrant is a negative positive, the third quadrant is a negative negative, and then the fourth quadrant is a positive negative. If you have that written down somewhere in your book or in your notes and put into your math folder, you can use that from this point forward as something that you've written down and used in my class. Might come in handy on the chapter test here in a couple of days. But it will make these a lot easier. Identify the quadrant where the point is located. And they tell you that I have a 2, a negative 5. So to graph the point first, I have to move to the right, so because it's positive, from my point of origin. And then what do I have to do? Well, then I have to move down because my second point is a negative 5. So if I go right and down, then I know my quadrant is going to be quadrant 4. I could have also looked at it as, well, it's a positive negative, and my quadrant 4 are always positive negatives. When I go to question 2, we don't want to skip that one since it seems to be all alone. It is a positive positive. Well, if I'm going forward when I run and then going up because I'm jumping, that's going to take me to my quadrant 1. Quadrant 1 is always running forward, jumping up. For quadrant 3, I have negative 6, negative 2. Well, negative 6, negative 2 takes me back and then down, right? So I go to my point of origin, I move back and down. That's always going to be my quadrant 3. Quadrant 4, going to my point of origin, going back and then up. So going back and up, a negative followed by a positive is always going to be quadrant 2. 5, positive, positive, going forward, jumping up. Once again, takes me back to quadrant 1, just like number 2 did. And then number 6 is a positive but negative. So I have to go forward and then jump down. That's going to be my quadrant 4. So on every one that's like this, all I need is the correct Roman numeral to show me what quadrant it's in. How do I plot that? Well, I could show that I'm moving in the right direction, then moving up so for a quadrant 1. But then your quadrants, if you had one to show your work on, get really messy with all those lines that you're going through. All right, so then the second part of the assignment is the 2 points are reflections of each other, across the x or y axis. Identify the axis. So when I'm looking at it, I have to figure out which one stays the same, and the one that stays the same is the axis that it's a reflection over. On 7, I have negative 1, positive 3, and I have positive 1, positive 3. The 3's stay the same to where the 1's are opposites one to another. The 3's are on which axis? Remember that it's always x followed by y, so my 3's are my y-axis, so this has to be a reflection on axis y. On 8, I have positive 4 for my x's, and positive 4, negative 4, those are opposites, right? So I know that my x-axis is the one that stays the same. That has to be my axis of reflection. For 9 and 10, I want you to think about it. Do them. Write down either x or y for your answers, and then come back and check how you did. So hopefully you did that pretty quick. You have 2 of the correct answers. When you looked, you saw that my x's were the same for number 9, so that has to be my line of reflection. And then when I looked at 10, it was my y's that are the same. They're both positive 1s. So I had to have a y reflection. All right, now then down here on 11, 12, 13, 14, I need to have a quadrant. So Roman numeral 1, 2, 3, or 4. It's a negative and a negative. So -8, -9, we said, was going to be in quadrant 3. Once again, I have it written down up here, so I could look at that and know any negative is going to be quadrant 3. My second one is a positive, and that's always going to be quadrant 1. So on 13, 14, I want you to solve for those. Come back and check and see how you did. So hopefully you've written down this example up here somewhere so you can always look at it and get it out. But you saw that your first one, your x is a negative, so you're running backwards. And then your second one is a positive, so you were jumping up. And that would take you into quadrant 2. And then on 14, you were running forward because it's positive, and then jumping down because it's negative, and that would always take you to quadrant 4. So hopefully you did those correct. Not a problem. When we get into this then, it says give the reflection point across the given axis. All right, so they give me the axis that has to stay the same, and therefore the opposite one has to be the opposite. There we go. So when it says, remember the axis is indicated, must have the same coordinate. So if it says the y-axis, my y-coordinate has to stay the same. The other one then has to change since it's a reflection, and it's just the opposite number. And we said on the opposite numbers, if it's a positive, I just simply make it a negative. If it's a negative, I simply make it a positive, and that would be my coordinate. So I have a y-axis. So I have -7, -7. My y-axis has to stay the same since it's my reflection axis, and therefore my first one has to change. So when I plot it out, then my reflection has to be a +7 now, then followed by a -7, because the -7s have to stay the same because they're the y-axis, which says is my reflection line. My x-axis on this one has to be my reflection line. So when I look at it, I have -15 followed by 18, so my x-axis has to stay the same. When I start writing this reflection coordinate, it has to have the same x, wherefore then my y has to be its opposite, and it has to be the negative. So the coordinates for this one, across the x-axis, would stay -15, but then be a -18, so I'd be plotting down in quadrant 3. You try your hand on 20, see how you do. Hopefully you looked at it, you thought my x-axis, my first one, has to be the same, so I know I'm going to stay at a +11, but it has to be the opposite, therefore, on the y, the second one, and therefore I'm going to do, instead of a +9, I'm going to do a -9. I'm going to drop down from quadrant 1, positive, down to quadrant 4 when I plot it across the y-axis. All right, so that's all there is to the lesson. It's not really difficult. I took a few extra moments to make sure that I explained it as detailed as I possibly can. Don't want any confusion. These are pretty solid ideas to be able to walk away from and to carry forward for the rest of 6th grade and all of junior high, and when you get into your first year of algebra and you're going to be plotting. Year 2, you also have to plot. So really, you're going to be using these for the next 5 years, 4.5 years of school when you do your math. If you have any questions, please come and ask. If not, then your assignment is page 187, questions 2 through 12. Yes, you have to do the last one. And page 188, your 6. Top 2 are always review, or top 2 are always with the lesson. Bottom 4 are always the review. Come and ask if you have any questions.